In this video, we are going to continue talking about the concept of inflation. And we're going to do that by looking at the quantity theory of money. So the quantity theory of money sets up a relationship between money, real output, prices, and what we call the velocity. Right? And it's defined by this equation. M times V equals P times YR. All right, so this is the formula that defines the quantity theory of money. Let's define some of these variables. All right, so M, this is the money supply. All right, so how much money in terms of cash and also in terms of kind of electronic savings in people's savings and checking accounts and so on and so forth, right? How much is out there? The velocity of, or V is the velocity of money. We'll write up a definition for the velocity of money here in a little bit, but it's the average number of times in a year that a dollar is spent on final goods, right? So how many times does a single dollar circulate through the economy in a single year? Then the P is the price level, right? That's obviously going to be a key factor because we're looking at inflation, right? And inflation are just, the inflation rate is the change in price level, right? And then finally, YR, hopefully we recognize Y as GDP, although we've only really seen it written as Y once or twice, I think. Twice, yes. But this is GDP, and with this little subscript R, we know that it is the real GDP. So just a Y, that's nominal. When we have this R subscript, that's going to tell us we're looking at real GDP. All right, both sides of this equation are equal to our nominal GDP. All right, to see this, all right, probably easiest to see it on the right-hand side of the equation. Right, if this is the real output, real GDP, and that is GDP adjusted for inflation, so adjusted for the kind of difference in price level from one year to the next, and then we multiply that real GDP by the price level, right? That's going to give us the nominal GDP, all right? And of course, if this is equal, if the right-hand side is equal to the real or to the nominal GDP, then the left-hand side must also, all right, for this equivalency to hold. All right, so I'm going to just quickly throw up our definition of the velocity of money. So again, this is the average number of times in a year that a dollar is spent on final goods. All right, so there is our definition. While we have this definition up, there are a couple of assumptions that we're going to make about this model. Right? One of the assumptions we're going to make is that real GDP and the velocity of money are stable relative to the money supply and inflation rate. All right, so let's see why we make this assumption. All right, so real GDP and the velocity of money are stable relative to the money supply. All right, so for real GDP, I think we mentioned this in the videos for chapter 26. GDP doesn't grow, all right, and probably real GDP even less so than that, right? It does, especially in already industrialized countries. Right? I think the U.S. usually has around a 2 to 3% GDP growth rate. That's what it usually is. It can be lower than that. It can be a little higher than that, but that's about where it stays. So it's not changing very much. All right. Then for the and then also just a side note for this. All right. So 2 to 3%. That's pretty standard, I think, for a lot of developed nations. But it rarely grows by more than 10%. All right. 10% is kind of the maximum, and that's in kind of extreme cases. All right. When a country has a lot of kind of underutilized resources, and they can kind of get some help from kind of trading partners outside, right, and get the things that they need to take advantage of those resources, and then they can really grow at a very high rate. All right, but that's usually not the case. So real GDP, usually pretty stable. The velocity of money is based on factors like how often workers get paid, the ability to find ATMs, right, or withdraw cash from them, and these things don't change often, right? Those things are pretty set, right? As far as how frequent people are paid, you're probably either on a, every 2 weeks or every month you get a paycheck. For most people, that's not changing very much. Availability of ATMs, they're not just like popping them up all over the place, because they are what they are, and you can go find one. All right, so those are not going to change very often. All right, now that's important because it leads us to some conclusions. All right, if we are looking at the cause of inflation, we can set up our equation. All right, we say, well, we just said that real GDP was pretty stable, so we're going to treat it as though it is constant. All right, so it is not going to change. We also said velocity of money was pretty constant, or pretty stable, so we're going to act like it is constant. All right, so the result that leaves us with is that any changes, right, to the equation, right, have to be through the money supply and the price level. Right? So if the money supply has increased, then that's going to mean that the price level has also increased. Right, and we can rewrite this in some growth rates. So if we want, and we will be looking at these in growth rates quite a bit. All right, so this is what we are going to be looking at. All right, so the little arrow above it just tells us that that's the growth rate. So that's the money supply growth rate, the velocity of money growth rate. The growth rate for price level is inflation. So we're going to put inflation in here, right? And then we're going to have the real GDP growth rate. All right, so with inflation here, right, the same thing that we had up here holds, right? If we have inflation, right, then it means that we must also have an increase in the money supply, right? And when we think about, well, what direction does this go in, right? The money supply is how much money is in the economy, right? That's controlled by the Federal Reserve, right? So is it that we have a change of inflation and then the Federal Reserve says, hey, we need to print more money, right? Or is it more likely that the Federal Reserve decides to print more money or create more money, right? And that causes inflation, right? And that latter one is the case, right? So inflation is often, or we could even say usually, caused by increases to the money supply. So when you increase the amount of money kind of out in the world, essentially there's more money but relatively the same amount of goods. So in order for you to kind of compete, the money becomes worth less relative to the goods, right? And so you have to spend more money to get the same good, at least nominally, right? The nominal price is going to be higher, right? By when all this money is created. Right, that's the usual cause for inflation. All right, but we're going to briefly talk about some of the other causes because we have two other things, right? Two other variables in here, and I left out a word. And even though they are relatively stable, they can change. All right, so when we're looking at real GDP or real output, however you want to say it, this can have an effect on the inflation rate. All right, so from 1834 to 1933, the U.S. existed or worked off of the gold standard for money. All right, so every dollar was a U.S.-backed guarantee that it's worth a certain amount of gold. All right, in fact, $1 equaled 1/20th of an ounce of gold. All right, so because of this, the money supply was fixed relative to the amount of gold that the U.S. government had. And the velocity of money also remained pretty fixed. All right, so we want to put this in growth rates. Although it doesn't really matter, we're going to get the same information. Actually, no, we don't need to put that in growth rates because we're going to have those things. All right, we want to be able to say, all right, these are fixed. All right, so if price levels are going to change, it has to be through real output, right? Real GDP. And we did see some of this. Right, at the time, kind of at the end, that 1933, we're getting into the Industrial Revolution, a period of a greater economic productivity in the U.S. and in other countries. So the real GDP growth rate, right, was going up for the U.S. Right, so to maintain this equality, that meant price levels had to go down, right? And so we saw what we call deflation, right? And we will talk a little bit more about that in a second. All right, but that is how, that's one example of when the real GDP growth rate affected the inflation rate. Right, the velocity of money can also affect the inflation rate. So during the Great Depression, right, especially at the start of it, there were a lot of what were known as bank runs. Right, so if you don't know what a bank run is, I'm about to explain it to you, but there's also a really good example of it in the, was it Julie Andrews? I think that's her name. Anyways, the older Mary Poppins movie, like the real old one. There's a scene in there where there's a bank run. There's another kind of classic movie that's got an example. It's a Wonderful Life, when everybody runs up to the guy and tries to get their money all at once. That's a bank run. They're afraid that they're going to lose all of their money, that the bank is going to kind of shut down and they won't get their money back, so they try to withdraw it all at once. Right? Now that's a problem that we're going to talk about later on, but this happened during the Great Depression. Right? So they took money out of banks where the money was going to be loaned out to people, right? So it would be out there circulating in the economy. And instead of allowing it to be in the bank, because they were afraid they were going to lose their money, they withdrew it, and then they kind of did the classic hide it in the walls, hide it in the mattress, put it in a mason jar, seal it up, bury it in the backyard. All right, well, if your money is buried in the backyard, then it's not going to be circulating the economy. Right? It's not going to be getting used for final goods. All right, and once again, we saw the inflation rate decrease as well. All right, so that is how the velocity of money changes, and the velocity of money can have an effect on the inflation rate. Now you'll notice that both of these examples are kind of, well, this is a very extreme case, kind of our Great Recession. The gold standard, it's kind of doesn't really matter because we don't have the gold standard anymore. But you can see this is not really often the case. All right. More than likely, if we have inflation, it's because the money supply has been increasing, right? So the amount of money in the economy has increased. We saw this in several places. We saw this in the Weimar Republic. There are stories of them printing off so much money and inflation being so bad that people would take a wheelbarrow full of marks up to buy a loaf of bread. They would go in to buy the bread, come out, somebody's dumped out their money and stolen the wheelbarrow because the money was worthless, right? And that's because they just printed so much of it. All right, but before we end this video, a couple of topics I want to hit. One, we mentioned it, deflation. All right, so deflation is a decrease in average price levels. So this would show up as a negative inflation rate. All right, so if we have deflation, that means kind of in general prices are going down. All right? And if we were to calculate a inflation rate, it would be negative because the price level would be higher in the earlier time period. Right? We don't want to get this confused with disinflation. Right? Disinflation is a reduction in the inflation rate. Right, so this is different from deflation because with deflation, prices are lower than they were. With disinflation, prices are still higher than they were, but they've gone up by less than they used to be going up, right? So you might go from a inflation rate of 5% to 3%. That is disinflation. All right, a decrease in the inflation rate. Again, if we have deflation, that's going to be a negative inflation rate. All right. Then finally, actually I'll leave this up for a second. One thing that we're going to note and that we're going to talk about time and time again is that changes in the money supply do not change real output in the long run. Real output is only going to be affected by real factors of production, right? So capital, labor, technology, right? Those are the things that are going to change real output. Increasing the money supply is not going to. You can't just print money and increase productivity in the long run. Right? We're going to continue to develop this idea, and you're going to hear me say this several times. Right? In the long run, money is neutral. All right, so that's really just a synopsis of the last couple of things I've said. We're gonna develop this more, right? But it's really just saying you can't use an increase in the money supply to increase your real output, right? But money is neutral in the long run, or in the long run, money is neutral. Again, we're gonna develop this idea some more as we go forward, but that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to start looking at some of the costs of inflation. All right, I will see you in the next video.